The sun hung low over the rolling fields of Clay County, Iowa, painting the stubbled corn stalks gold. Dust floated lazily in the autumn air, stirred by the crunch of boots and the shuffle of restless livestock pinned up behind weathered fences. The county fairgrounds had been transformed into an auction yard for the day. Tractors lined up like soldiers, rows of rusting plows, feed bins, and everything else a man might need to scratch a living out of the land. At the far edge of the crowd stood Henry Walker, his hat pulled low, shoulders hunched against the cold bite of October wind. He was 52, with a frame hardened by decades of work, but eyes that carried a weight deeper than any plowed furrow. His farm, 200 acres his father and grandfather had tended before him, was hanging by a thread. Drought had killed his yields, banks had tightened their grip, and now every acre of Walker land was mortgaged beyond what he could claw back. He hadn't come today to buy. Truth be told, he barely had enough left to keep the lights on. He had come because he needed a used plow blade. Maybe he'd get lucky, find one cheap. But as Henry wove through the crowd, he caught the looks. Whispers followed him like shadows. "That's Walker," someone muttered near the hay bales. "Lost near everything, didn't he? Fella shouldn't even be here," another voice sneered. "Man can't hang on to his own farm, but comes sniffing around others' scraps." Henry pretended not to hear, but every word stung. Clay County was small. Folks knew each other's business, and failure stuck to a man like mud. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man in a tan Stetson, called the crowd to order. "All right, folks, let's get started. Got ourselves a fine case tractor here, low hours, good condition. Who'll start me off at 5,000? Hands shot up. The bidding war crackled with energy. Henry stayed back, arms crossed, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. He felt like an outsider in a world that had once been his own. A young man in a pressed shirt and shiny boots, Rick Thompson, son of a wealthy land developer, caught Henry's eye. Rick had been buying up farms all across the county, turning them into plots for suburban homes. Rick smirked when he spotted Henry. "Well, look who it is," Rick drawled loud enough for folks nearby to hear. "Walker the wreck. You here to buy something, Henry? Or just here to watch how a real farmer does business?" A few men chuckled. Henry's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Silence was his shield. But his silence only fueled Rick's mockery. As the bidding rolled on, Henry stood motionless, hands buried deep in his coat pockets. To everyone else, he looked beaten, humiliated. They didn't know the envelope folded in his inside pocket, heavy with possibility. They didn't know what Henry Walker had decided the night before, staring across his darkened fields. Today would not be what they thought. Today would change everything. The auction rolled on like a thunderstorm, each item struck down with a crack of the gavel. Bidders shouted numbers, waved paddles, and slapped each other on the back when they walked away with a prize. The smell of diesel, hay, and fried food from a vendor's stand mixed in the cool air, creating a strangely festive atmosphere, at least for everyone but Henry. He kept to the fringes, his silence drawing occasional glances. Some pitied him, some mocked, but no one truly welcomed him. The farmers who once stood shoulder to shoulder with him at county fairs now gave him polite nods and turned back to their conversations. The Walkers had been a proud name around here. Now it was whispered with pity, or worse, dismissed entirely. Rick Thompson was thriving in the spotlight. Every few minutes, his confident voice rang out above the crowd. 6,000, 8,000, 10. He snapped his paddle up with the arrogance of a man who knew his bank account was bottomless. Each win came with a smirk in Henry's direction, like he was putting on a show just for him. At one point, Rick leaned back against a tractor tire, arms folded, and said loudly, "You know, fellas, some people shouldn't even bother showing up to these things. If you can't afford to keep your land, you sure as hell can't afford to buy mine." The crowd laughed. A few men shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged him. The auctioneer chuckled nervously and moved on to the next item. Henry's hands curled into fists inside his coat pockets. His father's words echoed in his mind. "A man's pride is worth more than land, son. But land is how you prove it." As the hours passed, Henry kept his head down, saying nothing, though the weight in his pocket seemed to grow heavier. Finally, as the auctioneer wheeled out a weathered hay baler, a model Henry knew inside and out, he reached into his coat. The envelope crackled in his hand. Inside was a certified check for more money than anyone in that crowd would expect him to hold. It wasn't from a bank loan, The bank had closed its doors to him long ago. It wasn't from family either. There was no one left but him. It was from the unlikeliest of sources, an old war buddy, a man Henry had once pulled from the wreckage of a Humvee overseas. The man had gone on to build a successful trucking company, and when he learned of Henry's troubles, he had offered help. Henry had resisted at first, too proud. But staring across his empty fields that night, listening to the wind rattle the barn doors, he realized pride wouldn't feed him, wouldn't save the Walker legacy. Accepting the check had felt like swallowing glass, but it had given him a weapon. The auctioneer slapped the baler. "All right, who's gonna start me off at 3,000? Rick's paddle shot up. 3.5, called another farmer. Henry's voice cut through the air for the first time that day. 5. The crowd turned, startled. Heads craned to see him. Henry Walker, the man they thought finished, standing tall and bidding bold. Rick's smirk faltered, and the silence that followed was heavier than the autumn sky. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off for just a moment. Then he snapped back into rhythm, his voice rolling like a drumbeat. 5,000. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Do I hear 5,500? Rick's hand shot up, sharp and cocky. 55. 6. Henry said calmly, his voice even, controlled. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Folks who had been drifting toward the food stand now pressed closer, sensing something unusual. For years, Henry had been a ghost at these auctions, silent, beaten down. Now he was standing straight, eyes locked, no trace of fear in his tone. Rick grinned, flashing perfect white teeth. 7. Henry didn't flinch. 8. The crowd gasped. Farmers nudged each other, whispering, "Where in God's name did Walker get that kind of money?" Rick's grin wavered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. 9. He barked. Henry's hat brim tilted just enough for his eyes to catch Rick's across the pen. Cold, steady, unblinking. 10. The auctioneer's chant rose with excitement. 10,000. 10,000 from Mr. Walker. Do I hear 10.5? Rick hesitated. His jaw worked. For the first time all afternoon, he wasn't smiling. He raised his paddle slowly. 10.5. Henry's answer came like the crack of thunder. 20. The yard went dead silent. Even the animals seemed to pause, ears flicking. The auctioneer's mouth hung open. I've got 20,000 from Mr. Walker. 20,000. Do I hear 21? But no one moved. Not Rick, not anyone. All eyes were on Henry, who stood as if carved from stone, his checkbook clutched in his weathered hand. Sold. The gavel slammed down. To Mr. Henry Walker. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in shocked whispers. Henry didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once, then raised his hand again. "What's next?" he asked. And so it began. One by one, the items rolled out. A seed spreader, a set of tillers, another tractor. Each time, Rick tried to outbid him, and each time Henry doubled the number without so much as blinking. 30,000. 50. 100. His voice never shook, his hand never wavered. By the third item, Rick's face had turned pale, sweat beading at his temple. He glanced nervously at his father, standing stiffly behind him, but no help came. The boy had wanted to show off, and now he was caught in his own arrogance. By the sixth item, Rick's paddle stayed down. His smirk was gone, replaced with tight lips and burning humiliation. By the eighth, it wasn't just Rick who had stopped bidding. The whole crowd stood hushed, as Henry Walker, once dismissed as finished, bought everything in silence. When the auctioneer finally announced the last gavel fall, Henry stepped forward, the check in his hand. He laid it on the podium without a word. The crowd parted as he walked out, his boots crunching against gravel. Not a soul dared laugh now. And behind him, Rick Thompson stared, beaten and small, in the ruins of his own pride. The sun was dipping low when Henry pulled his truck into the gravel drive of the Walker farm. The land stretched wide before him, empty fields bathed in amber light, the barn casting a long shadow across the dirt. For years, it had felt like a burden, every acre demanding more than he had to give. But tonight, it looked different. Tonight, it felt like something worth fighting for again. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. His hands were calloused, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but his chest rose with a steady, quiet pride. The papers from the auction sat on the passenger seat, proof of every item he now owned, proof that Henry Walker was not finished. As he crossed the yard, the screen door creaked open. His daughter, Emily, 16 years old with her mother's eyes, came running out. "Daddy? What happened?" "Everyone in town's been talking. They said you." Her voice trailed off when she saw the faint smile tugging at his lips. "I bought it all," Henry said simply. His voice was low, almost hoarse, but steady. "Every last piece." Emily's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with awe. She threw her arms around him, clutching tight. For months, she had watched him struggle, shoulders bowed under debt, nights spent staring into the dark kitchen with bills spread across the table. Now, for the first time, she felt his strength again. "But how?" she whispered. Henry pulled the worn envelope from his coat pocket, holding it up like a relic. "An old friend. Someone I once helped, decided it was time to return the favor." He didn't need to say more. Emily nodded, tears in her eyes. The news spread fast. By morning, neighbors who had whispered about his downfall now spoke in hushed tones about his comeback. Some stopped by to shake his hand, offering guarded congratulations. Others simply watched from the road, pride and envy tangled in their stares. As for Rick Thompson, his name was now a punchline. Folks who once cheered his bidding whispered instead about the day Henry Walker broke him without raising his voice. Even Rick's father, embarrassed by his son's arrogance, began pulling back from the spotlight. Henry never gloated. He never bragged. When reporters from the county paper came asking for a quote, he gave them nothing but a shrug. "I did what I had to do," he said. That was all. Weeks later, the machines he'd bought stood lined across his fields, shining like armor under the winter sun. Henry climbed into the cab of the tractor, Emily riding beside him, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than defeat. He felt hope. The farm would not be easy to save. Debt still loomed, work lay heavy ahead. But Henry Walker had sent a message that no man could ignore. He was not broken, he was not finished, and the Walker land was still in Walker hands. And in the quiet of that wide Iowa field, as the tractor roared to life, Henry allowed himself a smile. Not for the humiliation he had silenced, not for the pride he had reclaimed, but for the simple truth that against all odds, he was still standing, still farming, still Henry Walker.